Hello, welcome to part two of our Culture and Ethics series. And today we're going to be talking specifically about the influence of culture. In the last series, we talked a little bit about how these were entangled because it is something that we do. And the questions that were raised are really, should they be separated out? And as you can guess, well, we've kind of arrived at the point where we realize that they are indeed connected, but that's not how it's perceived. And in fact, it's perceived that science is this separate thing that's done, you know, clinically and objectively and without passion or recognition that there's things going on in the world. And probably the best evidence of that is how it's portrayed in the media. So when you look at things like Dr. O'Connor and Independence Day, this idea that he had no idea what was going on and was just excited that things were working. This is how a lot of people view science. But as we've been talking about, that's really not the reality. The reality is that these things are very much entangled and very much uh, work in tandem with each other. And today, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about how those two things have mixed over the years. So I'm going to introduce a term called the zeitgeist. And zeitgeist is this idea, it's very shortly, it's called the spirit of the times. But really, what it is, it's that there are times where culturally, socially, politically, economically, that the time is right for certain types of innovations to occur and be accepted. And if it something there was an innovation that would have happened a little bit before that or a little bit after it, it probably wouldn't have caught on. So a prime example I give of this in psychology is psychodynamic theory with Sigmund Freud, and it was popular because of the mechanisms that he chose. He chose sex and violence as the core drives, and basically built a theory around how we manage those two drives. And this was shocking to the culture at the time, particularly Victorians, which were very polite and genteel on surface, and things like sex and violence you didn't talk about. The other thing that made it really popular is that he couched it in the language of thermodynamics, which had just been coming to the front in physics. So this is not a mistake that he called this psychodynamic. He was borrowing the structure from physics, again, giving it kind of a structure that seemed plausible. So it's this balance between the two aspects of the psyche. Um, and when those things get out of balance, you get different types of effects. So his explanation mirrored kind of what was going on in physics and kind of gave it this extra boost. So the combination of the values he chose, which were attention getting, and it was sort of like, you could almost think about this as being like uh, reality TV at the time. It was, oh my God, I can't believe you're talking about this, but I can't stop looking. And the other part of it is that he designed it in such a way that it's not really falsifiable, which in some ways is genius, but it doesn't allow us to progress. So people may not believe or use psychodynamic theory, but they haven't disproven it. It's just that they have chosen not to use it um, as we go through. But had he come up with this idea a little bit later or a little bit sooner, it may not have caught on. And it was really the time was right for that kind of discovery. Um, the other things that zeitgeist can do is sort of couch what's acceptable science. What kind of things or practices are okay based on the norms of the times? And so a couple of things that I'll bring up with this are one, ethnocentrism. Um, this is this idea that there are certain cultures or certain races or backgrounds that are higher in stature than others. So this kind of was born out of the class system and the feudal system and definitely economic system. And it was really this belief that you could create better people through breeding, kind of thing that you saw a lot in monarchies where people were keeping things in line by keeping the family line pretty constrained. And this eventually gave rise to uh, Nazism and this idea of a master race. Uh, and that is going with this. Um, but it was this idea that you could sort of organize people or organize different races on different rungs and expect different things out of them. So this also became part of the immigration policy in the U.S. that this also was very much prevalent in there, that there were certain areas where immigration was allowed very easily and other areas where it was a lot tougher. And, as you know, we still see this today. At the same time, we have anthropomorphism, which is this idea of people being special. Remember, we talked about this before in the What is Science series, and that because we have kind of dominion over everything, it allowed us to sort of look at other things, and particularly animals, because they weren't thought to have consciousness or morals, and so we could just kind of experiment on them because they were in some ways below us. Now, contrast with it today, not that we don't do animal research, but now the protections in place for animal research are pretty stringent, and we'll talk about this in the third part of our series as we go through. Probably the most damaging kind of cultural idea that, particularly in the U.S., is this idea of social Darwinism. And if you remember Darwin's theory of evolution, that there's genetic and environmental pressures that favor some traits over others, people started applying that to social situations. That if you were in a poor situation, is because there's something inherently wrong or genetic in you, and that was where you were supposed to be. If you were aristocratic and you had money and breeding, that was because that's where you were supposed to be because of your genetics, because of your environment. And it was used in all sorts of arenas, and particularly in the U.S., to justify things like slavery and post-Reconstruction, separate but equal, if you will, facilities, which we know wasn't the case. But it also colored things like the types of science that was done, the study of physiology, looking at behavior, what kind of things do you expect from one group versus another, and really believing that there were fundamental differences that were based on race, when we know now that race is a social construct, particularly in the U.S. It was a political construct as well. But it guided the science because people kind of believed in this idea. And it wasn't just with race, but it was also with gender. And we're going to talk about that next to sort of give you an idea about how this all plays in. And again, it's not that science wasn't happening, but the type of science that was happening was also influenced by these larger cultural aspects. So in looking at gender, there's a great book that is a little older now, but I think they may put out a newer version, but by Scarborough and Fermato, called Untold Lives. And it's really just sort of the early history of women in psychology. And at the bottom of the screen here, we have three really influential women psychologists that definitely influenced the way I do science. And I'll talk about them shortly, but just to give you a backdrop on this, that women were really not allowed to earn advanced degrees until well into the 20th century. Coeducation in most places didn't start until the late 60s, 1960s for that. Although people were studying before, for instance, Mary Wynne Calkins, she was the first woman president of the American Psychological Association. She actually never got her PhD because she went to the Women's Annex. Although she went to Harvard, Harvard didn't grant degrees to women. And they offered the degree through Radcliffe. And she didn't take it because that's not where she did her work. So we see these kind of things happen all the time. And it was a lot of cultural things that sort of generated this. There's a general idea that women weren't smart enough. Now, I know that's not the case, but so I'm just giving you the argument here. It was believed that they were unsuited for professional careers emotionally. It was believed that education would interfere with their maternal instincts. So you would be a bad mother if you had an education from that. And even when they started getting academic positions or degrees, it was really hard for them to get work. And Dr. Jackie Gibson, who's probably one of the most influential developmental psychologists, and definitely in my mind, one of the greatest contributors to both perception, action, and learning. When she got her degree, it took her a really long time to get a job. In fact, she was turned down at a number of places simply because she was a woman. Famously, she went to work for Clark Hall at Yale and was turned down because he said he wasn't going to have a woman in his lab. Esther Thalen out of Indiana University, also an amazing researcher, had amazing influence on looking at motor control and development. And on the left, Dr. Ann Treisman, who also won the Presidential Medal of Honor for her work in cognition. So they're doing fantastic things. And in fact, today, they are the majority of PhDs. Women are the majority of PhDs that are being earned in psychology. However, in leader positions, women are still underrepresented. And definitely in terms of pay, across the board, they're earning less than their male counterparts with similar um, pay. So we see there's a lot of things going on still, but it was a large progression. It took a long time to sort of overcome this because a lot of it wasn't academic, it was culture. This also carries over into race. And again, the book I'll point you to here is by Robert Guthrie from 1976, Even the Rat Was White. If you're looking for this book in Miami, it's in my office. So if you're interested in it, just let me know. And again, sort of gave this early history of kind of looking at race in science. And again, enormous hurdles that were sort of stacked against them. And in fact, if you remember in the U.S., African Americans, it was actually illegal for them to have education. Um, Pretty much into the early 20th century, that a lot of those laws were still around. And when it was finally lifted, the facilities were not level as we go through. So uh, again, they're earning degrees, but it was only a small fraction of a percentage, as you can see here. And even that today in the 21st century is only around 8% um, as we go through. So I have listed here some of the local uh, major researchers who received degrees from local colleges to us. And one of the things that has arisen to try to right this imbalance, if you will, is that a number of associations have been developed to try to address specifically issues that are important to people of different backgrounds and making sure that their voices are heard. So as you see here, we have an Asian American Psychological Association. We have an Association of Black Psychologists. Miami actually has a student chapter, which I'm the advisor for. We have a National Latinx Psychological Association. We have Society of Indian Psychologists for Native American populations. Division 45 of the American Psychological Association is also devoted to looking at cultural issues, cross-cultural issues, and cultural competencies. So there is a recognition that these are perspectives that need to be had because it is very easy to get the idea that it is monolithic, that it is only one culture that is presenting. And clinically, that's also been an issue too, that we have to recognize that there are different constraints that come along with people being from different cultures and backgrounds. And so you kind of have to be well versed or familiar with those as well. Again, there's a plug for our Psychology Across Cultures course, brings this kind of idea to the forefront. So what I wanted to end up with today is just giving you a couple of examples of how these intersect in terms of the research. And we see that, culture definitely has an effect on science, but science also can have a reverse effect on culture as well. And uh, I'll give you an idea first. Idea of this intelligence testing, which was scientifically developed, but it definitely had cultural biases to it for this. And a lot of it was not just cultural, but also economically biased towards people. So if you were poor or if you were in the US, African American, you were at a disadvantage taking this test from the beginning. And it impacted what kind of jobs you can get, what positions you earned, and so on and so forth. Um, Kind of trying to reverse this was a really important by Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who gave us the Clark doll study, which showed that these kind of views on race and self-worth were really taught very early on, and that there are biases that were already existent. And so it was used as evidence against separate but equal facilities in schools because of this mark. And the video that's in the Canvas kind of shows this in a modern replication of this and shows those things are still there. So those biases are still being taught and indoctrinated and felt, um, again, way into the 20th and 21st century. Jane Elliott, in her Blue Eye, Brown Eye study, showed that you can actually create these biases pretty easily. And she does this to this day, kind of going around and sort of alerting people to these issues and how easy it is to create these biased environments and that we have to be really vigilant about that. Corel and his colleagues looking at shooter bias, again, something at the forefront of what's going on today, and that there are racial differences in threat assessment, and what's viewed as a non-threat in one person can be viewed as a threat in someone else, simply as a function of race. In addition, Wilson, Hugenberg, and Rule, Wilson and Hugenberg are actually former Miami folk, who showed that there's actually a bias in perception of physical size, that uh, when you match everything in dimensions, if you change the skin tone, they were doing this by doing computer generated, it changes people's assessment of size. So for the same size, and particularly African Americans are seen as bigger, more threatening for the same comparative size in another race. So there's already this bias that exists, that there's a threat level that's perceived in some races that's not perceived in others. And again, this is the science that we can look at this. This is also shown in emotion as well. And so uh, this is just meant to sort of give you an idea about how these things intersect with each other. And we'll be talking about next is how do we kind of control for this? How do we ensure that we are doing research that's both culturally sensitive and culturally accurate, and that we're treating our participants the way they should be treated? And that'll be the subject of our third video. Okay, everyone, we'll see you next round.